Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to WeatherBrains episode number 819. This is for Monday, the 27th of September, 2021. It's the pre-show, that magical time of the program where we share boring personal stories, humorous anecdotes, and we say very outrageous things. So thank you guys for joining us. A little late tonight. We're doing the show an hour early. And a little late here getting started, so we got to get right to it. I got to get the embed code going and get the guests invited so that they don't think we forgot about them. Got a good show tonight. Dr. Neil Frank. I mean, he is a legend, longtime director of the National Hurricane Center, is going to be joining us. And this is going to be a very, very fun show. All right, so embed code is good. And now let's get the guests going and our regulars as well. Hope you've had a good Monday. Weather is nice and quiet where we are, which is always a good thing. So let's see. I'm going to be sure I got Dr. Jacobs on my list. I think Bill invited him last week. All right. Hopefully everybody can join us. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. I think that's everybody. All right. All right, so they have officially been invited. We'll see if we can make this puppy fly. Yeah, I had a pretty good dry air mass settle in here. So this is for where we are. This is the 5th consecutive day with no rain, which was a welcome break. And we have no hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. We got Sam, which is going to be a system that kind of gets close to Bermuda, but it looks like it'll stay east of the island and of course, far east of the United States. And got the waves out in the middle of the Atlantic, or I say the Eastern Atlantic, one coming off the coast of Africa. So we'll see what they do. The early indications from the ensemble output from the European kind of suggesting those could recurve into the Atlantic. So that would be okay. And we're rapidly running out of names. You know, we've had like nine junk systems. I think 9 of them were these, systems that lasted for less than 48 hours, middle of nowhere. But anyway, we can go to the Greek alphabet. Gentlemen, welcome to the early start time.
The new start time.
Oh, is this permanent?
If it's okay with the big boss.
Works here. I mean, what we'll need to do is kind of coordinate the television side, because they will take, and again, they can take it delayed. It really doesn't matter, I guess.
Well, you can tell us when we can do that, James. I don't think we have another guest till early November that's set for 7.
No, we're good. If you want to do it, I'm good. I mean, it's fine here. I've
always wanted it to be a 3-hour show, so now it can be a 3-hour.
That's right. We can talk all night long. All right. So, had an interview with a kid interested in weather before the show, and I was a little late getting started. I think I got everybody invited correctly. If somebody had him on the show tonight, we'll get them in here. For years I would invite them into the station. If there's a kid that's interested in weather, bring the family up here. We do it on Fridays, and we have been closed to the public since March of 2020, and we are not open. Our spouses can't even come in here. I mean, it is a tight, secured area that hopefully they'll let us bring in families again sometime soon. So are we all here? Let's see.
We still need Dr. Frank. Jen's working on him right now.
Hey, Mark, can you hear us okay?
I can. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Hey, Mr. Suturf. So good to see you.
Murray, Mr. Span. These are some new people here. Jennifer and Kimberly and Neil and Troy.
Yeah.
Been too long.
It has been too long if it's been that long since you were on here.
It's like 2020.
Don't forget Jen's cat.
Yes, we keep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
Meow. Yeah. Jen's cat and the remains of Troy's bookshelf.
Yeah. Well, I think the last thing to do is have y'all come in and help put the books in at some point.
We're ready. I'm sitting on some Southwest miles. We'll come over there and do it.
Oh, crap.
What's disturbing? Neil looks no different now than he looked 30 years ago.
I know.
No, frankly,
he's like Dick Clark. The guy doesn't age.
Everybody.
That's what I told him the other day when Jen did the test call. I said he's found the fountain of youth.
No, there's clearly something wrong here. Whatever diet he's on, I need to get on that diet.
This is 1987, Neil here.
I hear you. He in front of the big thing in the Titanic. Remember that big behind him? Is that what that is?
Hey, Neil, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you fine.
All right.
Man, you sound
like
no different. You look no different. I mean, what is the deal? What is the fountain of youth here?
It's hurricane.
I mean, all right, let's get this thing started here so we don't miss any of the good stuff. It's going to be a good show. I'm excited. All right, record track 1, record track 2, and here we go. Change the view. Here we go in 5, 4. Oh, hang on 1 second. All right, here we go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You're listening to WeatherBrains. They're kind of a big deal.
You heard it. They're kind of a big deal. See, only Bill Curtis does the opening for this show. I mean, there's a million weather podcasts, but we get Bill Curtis. So welcome to WeatherBrains. This is episode number 819 for the 27th of September, 2021. And for those that are watching live, we're kind of starting a new start time here, Bill Murray. This is going to be permanent, right? We're going to push it.
This is breaking news. Union, the labor and management have all struck a deal, and looks like we're going to start at 7:00 from now on Central Time.
Now that's Central. Let's most people that watch are in the Eastern time zone, so that's 8:00 Eastern.
So James, in the 1950s, the average Major League Baseball game lasted an hour and 54 minutes, and now they last 3 hours and 7 minutes. So is that a sign that WeatherBrains will just go to 3 hours?
Why not?
Start earlier?
Why not? I mean, just
No.
Now I'm feeling old. Okay.
Yeah. Troy, it looks like you got your bookshelf back in place. When do the books go in?
I'm figuring about 2 or 3 years from now or something like that. But no, it's happening, but it's one book at a time. The movers are a little put out with me and everything else, but we're getting there surely but slowly.
Okay. Well, that's take it one day at a time. That's the way it works. That's how we kind of clean up this mess. Our tornado debris out there. You just take it one day at a time.
The same thing. And again, y'all, we pointed out before, and I know that Neil Jacobs and Neil Frank and everyone else understand. I am still amazed by the supply chain shortages that we're having to deal with every day. Just little things that are supposed to be going on here. Nope, couldn't find that, and we'll work on it. But it's taken day by day, so it is what it is.
It's Dr. Jacobs. Can't you fix this supply chain problem? You're kind of a big deal. You know people.
Yeah, you were commerce. What's the deal? Fix that.
I think it's mostly COVID related. Impacts, but yeah, I mean, everything is delayed. Even stuff that doesn't even make sense to be delayed is delayed.
But Neil, one thing too that's real interesting, and Dr. Neil Frank can probably speak to this, is that the winter storm in Texas just wiped us out down here. I mean, I was talking to someone a couple of days ago. Fortunately, I'm past that phase with the repairs here and everything, but talked to someone who was looking for a door for a house, and they were told 6 months from now at the Home Depot, 6 months from now. So, and Dr. Frank, I mean, we've dealt with that with hurricanes before then they've moved to shore, I guess, but I've just never seen anything like the supply chain stuff right now, which, Neil, you're probably right. That's related somewhat to COVID. In fact, probably large part to COVID, but the winter storm in Texas probably didn't do any good in contributing to that as well.
So Kim, I love your comment in the chat session here. We have 2 Dr. Neils
Yeah.
How do we handle that? And that's clearly a show title possibility right there.
Yeah, there it is.
Kim, how are you?
I'm doing okay, hanging in there. Although, living in the world of cascading disasters, as everybody is, when you talk about supply chain issues, they're affecting us as we're trying to recover from the hailstorm a long time ago. So yeah, we're right there with you, Troy. I think it's just
I don't know,
a
Kim.
shortage world.
That was the month when it was like one WeatherBrains host after the other was getting topped every other week, and people were like running from the show, And
we were falling like dominoes. I mean, goodness, it's been a rough year. So Jen, you have managed to escape a lot of the weather disasters this year, haven't you?
This year, but last year I had to get a new roof.
Yeah,
because I think I may have started this mess actually.
Yeah, it's your fault. See?
Yeah, yeah, because I had some pretty good hail, and I was, of course, filming it and send it to the Weather Channel to be, send it to Mark Elliott. I'm like, hey, put this on the air, would you? And but I ended up having to get a new roof.
Oh, the roof.
The roof. I need a new roof. So yeah. And the title of the roof, it was Storm Cloud. And the roofer, he's like, I think you're going to like this. And so he told me the title. I'm like, that's perfect. A meteorologist with a storm cloud roof. That's awesome. Right. Yeah. So.
Wow. And Bill Murray's had his own flooding issues.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, I went out there and built a dam yesterday, James. We'll see how that holds up for the next flood whenever it comes.
Yeah.
I like it. All right, let's bring in our guest here before.
Yeah.
Well, let's not forget, James, that you and your family were so blessed, in the middle of all this, that it may have been bad that day, but it could have been a lot worse. So
no, listen, the roof stayed on the house. I mean, we are the most fortunate of everybody here, because if the roof would have come off, we would be like Troy. I'd be in the Homewood Suites, and it would be the same situation. So to have that roof stay on that house was just unbelievable. So we are blessed. But Bill, bring in our guests before they run on us.
Yeah, James, first I want to introduce our guest panelist for tonight. We've been wanting to have him on for several weeks since Hurricane Ida, and it's been way too long since we had him at all. Of course, it's good if we only have him at every major hurricane that makes U.S. landfall, but Mark Suturf is joining us tonight. He, of course, chases extreme weather and does an outstanding service in providing back live feeds of hurricanes. So Mark, later during the Weather Roundup, we want to talk about Ida and your experiences. What else has been going on in your world?
Well, I'm going to quit the hurricane business and go into selling doors. Apparently, that's wow.
Show title.
It's been a remarkable 18 months. It's like this alternate reality, and here we are. And we've talked about this supply chain issues, and it's interesting. We talk about what James went through there with the tornado. I was in Noonan, Georgia in the summer, going down to Florida. We went through Noonan. And anytime I go on a road trip with the family, it's always a detour, not to some interesting thing like the biggest ball of string in the world, but it's usually some disaster from who knows when. And in this case, it was Noonan, Georgia, and then Mexico Beach and so forth. But Noonan, I mean, wow, that EF4 damage in this one small area of Noonan, Georgia, and to realize that happened at night. Our landscape in the lower 48 is dotted with these scars from these disasters, even in the desert Southwest. So here we are. This is what we talk about. So it's good to be back.
It's good to have you on the show. So we want you to join right in tonight. We've got a fantastic guest, and I'm going to turn it over to Jen and let her introduce him tonight, since she was able to get him on this show tonight.
It is an honor for sure. I've talked to Dr. Frank a couple of times this week, and I told Bill, I said, oh man, I could have talked to him all day. Just fascinating. And so I'm excited to have Dr. Frank on the show here, but he's a legend in the world of meteorology. Dr. Neil Frank grew up in northwestern Kansas. He attended Southwestern College with the goal of becoming a basketball coach. He served in the Air Force, was assigned to Okinawa, where he got a big introduction to the tropics there, and earned his master's and PhD at Florida State University, became a forecaster for the National Hurricane Center in 1961, and then a director in 1974. And he served in that position until 1987, and to this day has held the director position longer than anyone else. Worked as chief meteorologist for KHOU in Houston until 2008. He married his childhood sweetheart, Velma, in 1952. They have 3 kids, 10 grandkids, 15 great grandkids, right, Dr. Frank?
That's
Welcome
right.
to WeatherBrains. It is great to have you on here.
Well, it's great to meet all of you, and what an interesting panel you have.
Yeah, we're quite the crew, that is for sure. But my first question
that's
is,
way to phrase it.
Exactly. But my first question is, and we kind of talked about it a little earlier here, is I want to know what vitamins you're taking, or where is the fountain of youth, because you look fabulous. You just turned 90, right, on September 11th.
Blows my mind.
Yeah, I'm a 9/11 baby, as a matter of fact. And it's rather interesting, Jen, that the peak of the hurricane season is September the 10th and the 11th. And it isn't interesting that the director of the National Hurricane Center had a birthday on September the 11th. Needless to say, in my anniversary, wedding anniversary is on the 12th. Needless to say, I spent very few of my birthdays and my anniversaries with my wife. It seemed inevitable we was at the Hurricane Center tracking some kind of a hurricane.
That's right. Oh, but she stuck with you anyway. So that's great. That's great. Well, I want to just we're going to just cover your whole life story. This is your life, Dr. Frank. And so we're just going to go ahead and start from the beginning. Talk about growing up in northwestern Kansas in the 1930s.
Yeah, I was there in the Dust Bowls. People talk about droughts and it's been really bad and it's getting, no. Nothing compared to the Dust Bowl in the 30s. And I was a preteen at that time. And I remember going to school, and of course, we walked to school. You always had to have your goggles because you never knew when a dust storm was going to hit, and you had to protect your eyes. And there was no paint on any of the buildings. They'd all been sandblasted. And there were drifts of dust around that looked like snowdrifts. It was I don't know how my parents or my grandparents ever stayed there. My granddad was a farmer, so he had livestock and we had food and we planted big gardens. And so we managed to make it through that time. But it was a very, very difficult time.
You have a tornado story, which had my interest. Tell us your tornado story. You were learning how to drive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting that even though I spent all 20 some years of my life in Kansas, and particularly Northwest Kansas, I only saw one tornado during that whole time. Personally saw the tornado. And at that time, and I wished I could remember exactly the time, we learned how to drive when we were very young up in Northwest Kansas. But it seemed like to me that I might have been 12 or something like that, 13. And my dad took me out to show me how to drive. The first time that I'd ever been on a major road. And so we're cruised along there at a reasonable speed, and I held it and have felt his foot on top of my foot, and he pushed the accelerator down. And so here I am, first time I'd ever driven, and just shaking. And I looked back, and there was a tornado across behind us.
Oh my word!
Yeah, so
wow.
we were out in that tornado.
Wow. Now, did you have an interest in weather at all when you were growing up?
The only interest I had in weather was following my granddad. And my granddad was very sensitive to weather. In Northwest Kansas, if you got one good year out of every 3, you were able to make it. And so he followed the weather very carefully. But I had absolutely no interest in weather. I wanted to be an athlete, and that's what I did. I went off to college to play basketball and to play tennis. And all my desire was to be a coach.
So talk about that, because all of a sudden, you're going to Southwestern College and you want to be a basketball coach, but you had some promptings from some teachers, right, to get into the sciences. So talk about that. And
yeah, one of the science teachers was a big basketball fan. And so he came over to see me in my sophomore year, and he said, "Neil, you got to come over and major in science." And I said, no, I don't want any part of that. He said, "Let me tell you why. If you get a science major, when you go to get a job, they're always looking for science teachers. And so that'll give you a competitive edge. You can be a science teacher, basketball coach." And that's the way that I got into science. And so I graduated with an undergraduate degree in chemistry. And lo and behold, the Air Force was looking for science majors to go into their meteorology program. Isn't that interesting? So I backdoored right into meteorology.
Okay, so yeah, well, take us right to the Air Force then, because so you get into their meteorology program, and then they send you to Okinawa. And
Yeah, I had 1 year at St. Louis University, and what the Air Force did is they took us to a university. Penn State was one of those schools, MIT, Florida State, and so you would go to those schools for a year and get the equivalent of a bachelor degree in meteorology. And once I finished that year, I was off to Okinawa. I hadn't even seen the ocean wave in all my young years. And here I was in Okinawa. And the first summer I was in Okinawa, I was in 3 typhoons. It's a wild place in the summertime. So I got a violent introduction into the tropics.
so how long were you there, and what were your duties? Were you a science officer? Were you doing meteorology? What was your goals there?
Yeah, I was. As a matter of fact, what the meteorologist's responsibility within the service was to brief basically pilots in the Air Force. And so my daily routine was to brief pilots as they made their trips. And we also, of course, alerted the base whenever there was an approaching storm, like a typhoon. So I spent 2 years there and decided that the tropics were pretty interesting, and decided that maybe I'd like to have a career in the tropics. And I enrolled at Florida State University. Fortunately, they gave me a scholarship. And so I ended up with a master's and a PhD from Florida State.
When did you graduate from Florida State? When were you going to school there? In the 50s or?
Yeah, in the 50s.
Okay.
I was in the service from 53 to 57. And then I spent 2 years on the campus at Florida State from 57 to 59. Then I joined the National Hurricane Center in 1961 and continued to work on my PhD and received my PhD in the late 60s.
Talk about your time at Florida State, because I'm just curious, what was going on there? I mean, obviously you wanted your focus to be tropical meteorology. What was it like during that time to learn the college career? Who did you learn from? What was the curriculum like?
Well, we had some very interesting tropical meteorologists on our staff there. Herbie Reel, and if you know anything about tropical meteorology, Herbie Reel is one of the pioneers. It goes back some years. He used to come down every summer, and some of his students then were professors there at Florida State University. Dr. Noel Lasser, Dr. Jordan was my major professor. And so the emphasis was tropical meteorology. And in the summertime, these professors would all come down to Miami at the Hurricane Center, fly into the storm, and we would have daily briefings there at the Hurricane Center with these professors. So we were very much involved in tropical meteorology there at Florida State University.
Dr. Frank, you came to the Hurricane Center in 61, and I have a book of advisories from Hurricane Carla. And your name is already all over those advisories by the time Carla came along. So they threw you right in, didn't they?
Yeah, well, let me tell you, the National Hurricane Center has a different organization now than it did back in the 60s. In the 60s, there were 5 hurricane warning offices. One of them was in New Orleans. We had our office in Miami. There was another one in Puerto Rico, one in Washington, D.C., and one in Boston. So as Carla moved across the Gulf, we handled the advisories, and then we turned the advisories over to New Orleans, and New Orleans was responsible for issuing the warnings as Carla made landfall. Carla was a fascinating storm. It was probably the first storm that we had good radar information, and Dan Rather stood on the wall down at Galveston and broadcast some of those warnings, and actually was the first one to put a radar live on television. And as a result of Carla and his all of his activities during that storm, he became a national figure, and his story went on to the national scene.
Now, we're just lucky that Dan Rather didn't show up at any of our houses to interview us for something that we did wrong along the way, Dr. Frank. But you learned some nuggets of how to handle Dan Rather, didn't you? From early on in your time at the Hurricane Center as he interviewed you. That was a funny story. I'd like you to share it.
Yeah, Dan Rather prided himself in being the expert, the weather expert among the senior anchors. And so whenever there was a hurricane, he would call down to my office. And I remember the first time he called, he said, "I want you to be on my program tonight. Tell me about the storm." And so I told him everything I knew about the storm. And we went on live. And he spent about 30 or 40 seconds telling me everything that I had told him. And then he said, "What do you think about that, Dr. Frank?" And I said, "Well, you're right." And there was nothing I could add. So I learned a very important lesson. I always held back one or two nuggets that I didn't tell him. So when he would ask me and I said, "Oh yeah, Dan, let me tell you about this point too." And I always had something more to offer. But Dan Rather and I became good friends down through the years. Very, very interesting person.
Carla was a huge storm, if I remember, Dr. Frank. I mean, don't I recall that hurricane force gusts were measured all the way from Corpus to Galveston along the Texas coast, and that seems like a very impressive storm.
It was a huge storm, and it was intense. But the center of the storm moved across Matagorda Bay, which is 60, 70 miles south of the Houston area, and the storm surge there came up some 20 feet. As a matter of fact, down at one of the communities along Matagorda Bay, it washed out the entire foundation underneath the city hall. Now, fortunately, it was on piling, so City Hall was 10 feet in the air, and they had to get a stepladder to get up to the City Hall at Port O'Connor, I believe it is the name of it. It was a huge storm. Not only that, it was a slow moving storm, and it did all kinds of wiggles and waggles as it was approaching the coastline. It made 2 complete loops of 8 or 10 hours each. And so where do you put the warnings? You know, you're seeing it move to the left, and so you extend the warning down the coast, and then it moves back to the right. Well, it did 2 loops before making landfall. And it was a very difficult storm to forecast.
Now, you've mentioned radar. So as we walk through your career, I'd like to talk about how the technology changed. You also mentioned that the Hurricane Warning Service, changed because in the 1930s, I believe, they decentralized the forecasting process. So how was it broken up, the division of duties in the Gulf? How did New Orleans know when to take over from Miami?
Well, we had a magic line out there, and when the storm crossed that line, it went to New Orleans. Now, see, all that changed in 1967. And that's when the National Hurricane Center, as we know it today, was established. And there was a couple of reasons why we did that. Number one, if you remember back in the 60s, a computer was room size. I mean, a little computer was room size. And so it was very expensive. So we decided rather than to put computer system at 5 different offices, we would consolidate all of our activities there in Miami. And it also, many of the forecast offices, the senior people were World War II veterans, and they were about to retire. So we decided to establish the National Hurricane Center and bring in people that had PhDs or masters working towards their PhDs, and to really improve not only our technology, but our ability to research some of these storms.
Talk about the legacy of Grady Norton. I don't know if you ever had the opportunity to meet him, because I think he probably passed away before you had a chance to. But talk about his legacy at the Hurricane Center. Being an Alabamian, we are really proud of him, and he seemed to be sort of the first Hurricane Center director before there was a Hurricane Center.
Oh, absolutely. And Grady Norton was a great individual. He died in the storm. I believe he died in the storm in '54, if I remember right. But he died while he was working, and he had great confidence, public confidence. One of the things that I learned from Grady Norton would watch these hurricanes move along, and as he began to see one of them begin to turn, he wouldn't tell you that it's turning. He would say, "We forecast it to turn," and then he would come back at the next advisory and say, "Look at that, it's turning," just like we said. But he had tremendous confidence among the public And he was a great individual. Amazing things that he did with such little information. And that's amazing thing to me. You know, it's interesting if you look back to Grady Norton. I went back and looked at a lot of the advisories that he issued. They would be one short paragraph for the whole advisory. Hurricane warnings are now in effect. The hurricane will be here tomorrow. Take action. That was it. Well, now we have a book, you know, 5 or 6 or 7 pages that are issued. And, you know, I spent some time at the TV station relaying this information. There's no way that a TV forecaster or a radio broadcaster can assimilate all of that information in the short period of time that you have to go on the air and tell it. So I'm not sure that we've done a very good job of communicating that information to the public. Maybe Grady Norton was right. Just say hurricane warning, take action.
Well, in your advisories, in like Betsy in 65, Camille in 69, they still, you know, were relatively short and to the point. I guess part of that was you had to type them on a teletype, Troy Kimmel, and that probably made you keep them a little shorter, I'm sure. So by Betsy in 65, did you have good access to satellite data by then?
No.
Dr. Frank, no?
Tyro's data was the first we had, was like in 1967 and 1968. And Tyros, you remember the satellite, it didn't rotate around the Earth's axis, the equator. It had about a 45-degree angle across, and so you'd see a strip, and then the next time around you'd see another strip. And I put together the first paper that documented some of the hurricanes that we saw from these Tyro strips in 1967. And I think we saw 3 hurricanes on the Tyro strips. But it wasn't until 67, 68 really, that we begin to see the geocentric satellites, and therefore we could see the entire Atlantic Ocean.
Now, Hurricane Camille is real important to a lot of us. It was my first hurricane. Troy was you know, young then. James was young. And I'm always fascinated by that story. That Saturday morning is sort of steeped in mystery and lore to me. Take us back to that August 16th, 1969, Dr. Frank, when, you know, all the Hurricane Hunter planes were in Project Storm Fury and you got a storm in the Gulf. Take us back and put us in that morning.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that I was asked to do a 50 reunion or celebration of the storm in 2019. And so I went back to the Mississippi coast and spent 3 days there, searching around and taking pictures and reliving what all took place then. A couple of points that I would make as Camille was approaching. Not only did we have storm surge in the Atlantic, and all of the research planes and most of the reconnaissance planes were assigned to that mission. But if you remember, there was also, what was the celebration in the Northeast when the kids got together?
Oh, Woodstock.
Woodstock. Yes. See, Woodstock, it was taking place at that same time. And there was another, as I remember right, there was a major murder that year. I can't remember now what that was, but I got that in my notes. But so there wasn't a lot of attention paid on this storm in the Gulf of Mexico as it entered the Gulf of Mexico. Then it exploded and it got very strong. And the Navy plane went out and took a look at it, and they looked at it on radar and said, "We're not going in that." And they turned back and they didn't go in it. So Dr. Simpson, who was the director there at the time, I was his assistant, and Dr. Simpson called the Air Force and asked if they could turn around the crew that had just been in the storm, and they could waiver their crew their rest time. And so that crew got back into the storm, and that's when we found the 905 pressure. And for the first time in the history of the Hurricane Center, we put 20 feet in the storm surge forecast. And fortunately we did. It was 20 plus. I think it was 24 finally.
Now, it seemed on that Saturday that the storm was going to go to the northeast and maybe affect the Florida Panhandle, Panama City area.
Yeah.
But by Sunday morning, the track was shifting back to the west. Talk about that process and how that was that Sunday morning.
Well, you got to keep in mind, even in 1969, we didn't have new numerical models that they have today. So we plotted our own maps. And one of the maps that we used a lot was up around 20,000 feet, 500 millibars for you meteorologists. And we plotted that map and we looked for the steering currents on that map. Well, needless to say, it didn't take much of a change to change the steering currents. And so our ability to forecast precisely where the storm is going to go was very, very difficult. And so we would have those surprises all the time. But the big surprise was how quickly this thing strengthened.
Truly, truly amazing. Talk about Dr. Simpson for a moment and his legacy and about him as a person, Dr. Frank.
Oh, he was an incredible individual. Dr. Simpson was the kind of a guy that you wanted to bring in when your company wasn't doing well, because he was a visualizer. He saw into the future. And he did so many things. He went to Hawaii and did some things out there, put a rain gauge up on top of a mountain there at Kauai, where they're measuring over 300 inches a year. And he went to Washington, D.C., and he helped establish the tornado warning service. And he was the one that initiated the flights into storms. So in the late 50s, 58, 59, we got a DC-3, and they put some instruments on it. Well, that was all Simpson's thing. Then he came back to become the director of the Hurricane Service until he left in 1964 and finally retired. But he did remarkable things during his career.
Now, we had James Fleming, an author, on several months ago, and he was talking about Joanne Simpson. He had written a book about her, and it was very fascinating, a fabulous show.
Yeah.
But he mentioned that a little brouhaha broke out between Dr. Simpson and Robert White, the NOAA administrator, or ESSA administrator, I guess, at that time.
That's right.
Talk about that if you know anything, because that sort of piqued our interest that night when he was telling us that story.
Well, I don't know as I remember all the details, but I do remember after Camille, Simpson got to some of the political figures, and they brought pressure on Nixon to do something about a hurricane reconnaissance and hurricane research. And of course, that's when he tangled with Bob White, because that wasn't the thing to be doing. You didn't go over Bob White. You went through Bob White if you wanted to get something done. And so there was some ill feelings there for a short period of time. But as a result, we got the reconnaissance airplanes, and the crew that we have there today is the result of the seeds that Dr. Simpson planted.
Talk about Project Storm Fury for a moment, because we referred to it there. The research scientists were seeding Hurricane Debbie at that same time. Talk about your feelings on that program.
Well, I don't think that we could see the problem is you'd have to have repeated experiments before you could establish whether man was doing anything or not. And just flying out into one storm isn't going to establish the truth. As a matter of fact, one of the things that killed Project Storm Fury is that Mexico says, don't mess with our storms. So there was a very strong restrictions on where you could fly into a hurricane and experiment with, which meant that it had to be out in the middle of the ocean. And there it was very difficult to get airplanes out there to monitor it. And it turns out it just wasn't realistic to try to pursue that. I wasn't ever really that sure that human beings could mess around with big forces like that and have an impact.
Yeah, that does seem like a bit of a stretch. But talk about some of the other hurricanes in the 70s. We went through sort of a lull, but we experienced Eloise in 75 in the Florida Panhandle, and
Right.
Frederick, of course, around Mobile in 1979. And any other hurricanes you want to talk about before Jen takes you to Hurricane Allen in 1980?
No, as a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting that the 70s was a quiet period as far as hurricanes are concerned. Now, it's interesting that hurricanes follow the temperature of the earth. The temperature of the earth undergoes a 60-year cycle, at least it has for the last 150 years. You have 30 years when it's warm, 30 years when it's cold. So we came out of the little ice age in the late 1800s, and the earth warmed, and there was some big hurricanes in the late 1800s. Bad stuff. And we'll get to that when we get to Ida. And then we went into a cool period until 1910. And there was a lull in hurricane activity. Then we saw the earth warm again from 1910 to up into the 1940s. And there was a whole flurry of hurricane activities in the 40s and the 50s. As far as landfalling storms, it was one of the worst periods that we've had in the United States. Then with the warm period ending in the 40s, in the late 40s, we went into the cool period down through the 70s and the 80s. And then another warm period that began in the 80s and went up until the turn of the century. Now we should be in a cool period now, and the earth hasn't cooled, but it's leveled off. There's been no warming for the last 2 decades as far as the earth temperature is concerned. So if you take a look at hurricane activity, we had a whole flurry of activity when we had the warm period in the teens, 20s and 30s and the 40s. And then we went into a lull of activity when we went into the cool period. I don't know whether you remember or not, but that's when we were headed towards an ice age in the 70s.
Yep.
I don't know whether or not if you remember that. Well, the earth cooled for 35 years, and boy, the hurricane activity dropped. That's when that I was the director, and we kept wondering, where are all the hurricanes? Some years, I think in 1983 there were only 4 named storms for the whole year. Now that says it was a quiet season. No, it wasn't that quiet because Alicia made landfall here in Texas. And then we went back into the warm period, back into the 80s and the 90s, and so far. And so we've seen an increase in hurricane activity over the last few years partly because we're in that warm period. Now, you asked specifically about the 70s and 80s. Well, that was when we were in a lull period, okay? So we didn't have a lot of hurricane threats during that time. Although Frederick was certainly one that we paid attention to, and Eloise was certainly one that I had to deal with.
One more storm. I have 3 storms I want to talk about. Let's go back to Agnes in 1972. I used to live in the northeast part of Pennsylvania, Wilkes-Barre, Scranton area. And so that obviously was a big flood maker. Was that one of the first big battles with inland flooding from a hurricane that we had to deal with?
No, there have been other inland floodings too, but that was certainly a major one in the Northeast. And Agnes was just a tropical storm when it moved up in there, but boy, it stalled and it rained a ton. But you can go back into the 40s in Texas, and there were times there when we would have 40, 50 inches of rain inland with a stalled tropical storm. So Agnes was one that hit the Northeast. There's no question about it. As well as in recent years, there's been a couple of other storms that have been very wet too.
Yeah. So I ran across a story about Hurricane Allen back in 1980 that you had to get on the amateur radio station to communicate after they lost their conventional communications. Can you tell that story? I think that's fascinating, especially for those. I'm not an amateur person, but there's several of the panel here that they're radio guys. So what was that like, to communicate that way with Allen?
Well, it was interesting that the amateur radios came in and set up a station there at the Hurricane Center. And I'm glad that they did, because an example was Allen, when we could then use the amateur radios as our primary source of communication. And so they did a great job in coming in there at the station. The other thing that was so important about getting the amateur radioers in the station is they were in contact with these places where the hurricane was hitting. So we were getting feedbacks directly from the locations where that was occurring. And if I remember right, we were getting reports from Honduras from the radio operators, Roatan, the island just north of that. Maybe that wasn't Allen, but I remember in one storm that we got a lot of reports from Roytan from the amateur radios.
That's great. So then talk about Hurricane Alicia. That was 1983. That was a Houston storm.
Yes, it was. And it was a tropical storm moving along the northern Gulf of Mexico, and nobody was too worried about it. And then in the final 18 hours, it doubled in strength and made landfall as a Category 3 hurricane. It was the first kind of a major hurricane since Carla in 1961 here. And if you don't include the storm in 2008, we haven't had a major storm since then either, a direct hit on Southeast Texas. But it was a surprise. It was a huge surprise and did a lot of damage in downtown area, a lot of roof damage. And what we found out in Alicia, that they put a lot of garbage, well, air conditioners and things like that on roofs, and they began to blow off and break windows. And so there was a lot of wind damage with that particular storm. And that was only a Category 3.
Well, Dr. Neil, Frank, I also hear that downtown Houston, it was kind of the discovery too. They all apparently used a lot of rock at the top of those buildings downtown that I guess otherwise would have been okay until it started blowing around and like you say, other garbage.
Well, absolutely. And that, when you say rock, you put this chat up there and put it in, and it would be embedded in the tar.
Yeah.
And that was a standard kind of a roof. Well, that didn't work very well in this storm. That's one reason why in most of the hurricane prone areas, they don't allow tile roofs, because they don't want tiles to come flying off either.
Dr. Frank, you worked with some amazing people. We've already talked, for a few minutes there about Dr. Simpson, but talk about Gordon Dunn. And I'm going to ask you for another few folks in that impressive Hall of Fame gallery of hurricane folks.
Well, Gordon Dunn was the man that hired me to come down to the Hurricane Center. And when I joined the Hurricane Center, there was 5 of us. We did forecasting for the state of Florida, but we also added on in the summertime the hurricanes. So I was the first PhD to join the Hurricane Center before we reorganized in '67. And so I worked with some really, really credible forecasters. They didn't have the academic backgrounds, but they had the experience background. A fellow by the name of Ray Kraft, you probably have never heard the name. Ray Kraft and Clyde Connor were at New Orleans at one time.
Right.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about Mr. Connor and Mr. Kraft, so they keep talking about them for a minute.
Yeah. Well, they were both at New Orleans, and a fellow by the name of Lichtblau was the man in charge there. And when he retired, Connor and Kraft were good, close friends. Well, they gave the MIC to Clyde, and Kraft was so upset, he transferred to the Hurricane Center in Miami. And I worked with Ray Kraft night after night, and he was an amazing person. They were so much in touch with the weather, but, we didn't even have, we had reconnaissance. But when you got out over the open sea, if you couldn't reach it with a reconnaissance plane, how did you find out something was there? They lived with those ships that came across the ocean. And when that ship got to port, there was a meteorologist there to meet him and say, hey, your barometer's off. You need to calibrate it. But Ray Kraft was an amazing individual. The first time I met Gray and I started working with him, I noticed that he had a whole handful of washers in his hand. And, if you take coins and kind of flip them around, well, he'd walk around the office flipping these coins. And whenever we gave a hurricane, I noticed that coins would flip faster and faster and faster and faster. And I said, and so the first time we were working a hurricane, I was watching him, and he pulls out these washers and he uses this to draw his isobars, circular isobars. And once he zeroed down on ship and a pressure and the right size of washer, he could identify where the center of that storm is with probably 30 miles. It was amazing, the techniques that he showed us. We have a wind pressure relationship, central pressure wind relationship. Well, Connor and Kraft worked that up through decades of looking at 1 mile winds, sustained 1 mile winds, and the central pressure as the storm crossed the coastline. It's still very valid today, even though the Hurricane Center is kind of ignoring it.
Talk about Nash Roberts for a minute. He was a fixture in New Orleans.
Big.
Some people viewed him as a problem, but the public adored him.
Oh, they loved him in that community. One thing, you didn't go to Nash Roberts and say anything negative about Nash Roberts. I'll tell you that. And he was an amazing, I don't know, Roy, did you ever see him give a presentation? I don't know whether they ever did, but he was an introvert. And he stood up at he had a chalkboard, and he would stand there with his back to you and maybe kind of look over his shoulder and draw these things. But man, the people in New Orleans loved him. They worshiped the ground that he walked on. And he was a very good forecaster. I don't take anything away from him. But he was a fixture in New Orleans, no question about it.
Well, many of us, of course, were, just thrilled when the Weather Channel came into being. And of course, we sort of looked for that 50 minutes past the hour with the tropical update because of John Hope. Talk about him for a minute.
Yeah, John Hope joined the National Hurricane Center from a group that was established with the space flight. When they established space flights in Central Florida, they decided rather than to bring big computers in and establish a whole meteorological unit, we already had that and existed in Miami. So they established a space flight meteorological group there in Miami. And John Hope was one of the first people in that group. And eventually, when they kind of disbanded that, we brought him on into the Hurricane Center itself. And so I had him as my deputy in the hurricane area. He was an amazing person and had great skill in forecasting hurricanes.
And I guess the last person on my list, and you probably got some others there, Bob Sheets, of course, was an amazing man too.
Yeah, Bob followed me. And
Right.
One of the things that Bob emphasized was the need for better reconnaissance. And so he put a lot of his effort into getting better planes and better instrumentation on those planes. Now, at the time that I took over as the Hurricane Center, I saw a need to educate the public. Kind of interesting that when I took over as the director of the Hurricane Center, here I have a PhD, and that qualifies me to do research. And we had satellite pictures for the first time, and I wrote a number of papers about what we were seeing on the satellite pictures. As a matter of fact, I was the first one to document that African disturbances come all the way across the Atlantic. And at that time, 75% of the hurricanes were formed by African disturbances. So I was involved in the research, and we had satellites, and all this was exciting. And I took over, and I asked my staff, I said, I wonder how many people living along the coastline have ever experienced a major hurricane. Nobody knew. So we went and looked at the census figures for every coastal county from Maine to Texas. And we found out that 80% of the people that live along the coastline have never experienced a major hurricane. So my question is, who should tell them about that? Well, that really is the responsibility of local government. But then when we started to look at the individuals that were involved in local government, we quickly realized that that wasn't a source of reliable information. So my whole career changed, and I began to emphasize the need to go to the public and to inform them. And I was averaging about 100 talks a year when I left the Hurricane Center. I talked to Rotary clubs, Kiwanis Club, church groups, Marine groups, you name it, and the governor's staff or FEMA representatives. So I developed a very interesting slide presentation using 35 millimeter carousel projectors.
No Zoom presentations back then, huh, Dr. Frank?
Absolutely. And I told you earlier that I was very comfortable giving a presentation with a 35 millimeter carousel because I figured I could change the bulb in 2 minutes, and that's the only thing that could go wrong. And then I've gotten into PowerPoint, and I don't know what to do. I mean, if it quits, I'm dead.
So I'll ask one more, Dr. Frank, that everyone else is wanting to have at you for a couple of hours here. But do you think that was the part of your legacy that you're most proud of, are those preparedness talks? Because that still is important to this day.
Well, I don't know. I would say I don't put it as important. I'm just saying it was necessary. It was necessary to try to inform the public so that they could make better decisions, and inform local government so we could have better building codes. And so I think that we did achieve some success there. Although I still don't understand why people won't evacuate when we tell them to evacuate. The question, I'm not sure that we will ever understand totally why people ignore warnings like that. I think probably the first reaction that people have is denial. Whenever you have something that's bad news, and it's rare, my self-defense is to deny it. And I think that's exactly what happens. And so they deny it until they're forced to recognize it. And by that time, it may be too late. But I would say that that was a very important function that needed to be done. And not only that, but I saw a need to open up the office so the media could come in and sit at our shoulder and see what kind of uncertainty there was in our decisions. And I think that was important too.
So if that was a necessary thing, what would you be most proud of during your time at the Hurricane Center as the director?
Well, again, I don't like to use pride. I just think that we did some nice things by informing the public and working closer with the media, and also working closer with FEMA. When I first went to the Hurricane Center, we typed our messages on tape. We didn't have even a typewriter. We type them on tape and take them back and run them on our machines. And that's the way they would dispute it. And we would take this copy. This is the advisory, and it was seldom over more than a couple pages. And we would run into the media room and throw it at them and close the door and leave. There was no communication at all. And I just don't think that was a very good idea. So opening the door and allowing the media to come in and to see the uncertainties that we were faced with, I think helped them to project more reliability on the warnings. And so I would think that my personal is that was an important thing that needed to be done. And I was just there at the time when it was done.
These stories are just incredibly fascinating. No, I got to tell you, this is really entertaining for me. So I've got a couple of questions, but I actually grew up in Miami. I was in Miami in the 70s and 80s, the entire time you were at the Hurricane Center. And I remember my class taking a field trip over there. And I got to think at some point our paths might have crossed early on. But I've been reading recently this book called Thor's Legions, and it's about Air Force weather and the history going from, I think, the 30s to the mid to late 80s. And they talk a little bit about how the Weather Service, before it was part of NOAA, got involved in some numerical weather prediction. Can you talk to us a little bit about what it was like when the barotropic model first started becoming available, and were forecasters, were they buying into it, or did they think it was just science fiction, or how long did it take to adopt believing in numerical weather prediction?
Well, that came up, the barotropic model came along in the 60s. And at that time, I remember we had two computers that were the size of a big closet. I mean, huge computers. And so to even try to run the model in real time, it wasn't possible. We would see the results some hours after we started running the model. So we were still doing hand analysis and projecting and forecasting our hand analysis. Boy, I have driven map after map, surface map, 500 millibar map, and we worked on those. We had techniques that we could use to determine the speed and the motion and things like from those things. So I would say that numerical models really didn't come into the operation until probably in the late 60s and maybe the early 70s. In the early years, the barotropic wasn't very useful. It was there, but it certainly didn't provide us with a lot of information. So we were back to doing our own analysis. And of course, we had coastal radars when the storm would get close to the coast. We did have reconnaissance. And every day we would send an airplane out from Puerto Rico, and they would fly out to, 600 miles or so to the east and come back. And that was about it. We relied very heavily on other countries to provide weather information, and that wasn't all very successful. But we paid very close attention to the reports that we did get. We lived with the weather. They don't do that today. If we would take numerical models away from the forecaster today, I don't know if they would be able to make a forecast.
Yeah.
It was unreal.
I think they should teach hand analysis in schools still.
Well, you learn things by the hand analysis that you're not going to see. You just gloss over these things. One of the things that I watched very carefully was 24-hour pressure changes, 6-hour pressure changes, 12-hour pressure changes, and we drew these up every 6 hours, and we watched the patterns as they developed. And those pressure changes allowed us to project into the future what might happen. I think in 24 hours or 48, maybe not 40, 24 hours, even in the 60s, I think our forecasts were reasonably good. Our forecast air was roughly plus or minus 100 miles for a 24 to 36 hour forecast. Well, they've reduced that to about half that today. But boy, I tell you what, it has cost us a lot to get that 50% improvement. So yes, we have improved. Have we solved the problem? No, we certainly haven't solved the problem in terms of intensity.
I guess really to do a lot of this verification out in the open ocean, you were pretty reliant on observations from ships. Were there other sources of observations? Was it fishermen or commercial shipping?
No, this would be ships that cross the ocean. So it wasn't commercial fishermen, it was so much the commercial ships. And of course, the Eastern Atlantic has very few ships. So if a storm formed in the Eastern Atlantic and a ship didn't stumble into it, we didn't know that it was there. It's kind of interesting if you compare the number of storms that we list in the Eastern Atlantic today compared to when I was there in the 60s and the 70s. We were, I look back through the records, and we were averaging about one storm every 2 years in the Eastern Atlantic. Today, they're averaging about 3 storms a year because of satellites. In some years, in 2005, we had 7 storms form in the Eastern Atlantic. We wouldn't have even known they were there if it hadn't been for satellites. So satellites has certainly given us an opportunity to log in some of those storms in the Eastern Atlantic.
Prior to satellites, if you didn't have ship obs, did you ever see situations where for no apparent reason, the swell would just pick up along the coastline? Did anyone ever use that to wonder maybe there's a storm out there?
Well, to see the swells come along the coastline, a storm had to be pretty close to the coast. And we did have reconnaissance. So we could fly out east of the islands and identify these systems as they come across and into the area of the Caribbean. So no, I'm telling you. Now, once we saw an isolated ship, I go back to Ray Craft, and he just zeroed in on that ship, and we watched everything that captain reported. And swells was one of the things that we would watch. And it's amazing, I told you, how he identified the center with these low washers. And it's amazing how accurate he could be with just that as a tool. But he had to have a ship.
Dr. Frank, Troy Kimmel here, and I have to tell you that being in Austin weather, TV weather, back in the late 80s, I know you went to KHOU, I guess, in the summer of 87 and up until the summer or spring of 2008. Still have friends in Houston that tell me even today, they say, wish Dr. Neil Frank were there today to tell us what to do. So your history there is amazing, but I've always found your career to be interesting because you were at the government level, National Hurricane Center, and then all of a sudden you're back at the broadcast level again in Houston with everything you've seen in that time period. And what are the things that you discovered pretty quickly when you got into broadcasting there at KHOU that I'm just interested in your thoughts when you got there? And it's something you were there for 30 years or 20 years, and I'm just interested in your thoughts about when you got into broadcasting.
Well, the first two broadcasts I made, I realized that I shouldn't be there. that was the main thing. Troy, the thing that would bother me more than anything else was the time constraint.
Yeah.
And when I got there, they told me I'd have 3 minutes. Well, I would go back and prepare my graphics and everything, and I had the thing down solid for 3 minutes, and then somebody squawked in my ear and said, "Get out, get out." You know what I'm talking about, right?
I know.
Welcome to our world.
And so I approached TV as a reporter, a weather reporter. I had a message that I was going to tell. And I used to tell my producers, you wouldn't cut one of your senior anchors and call him in the middle of it, cut out 3 sentences. You wouldn't do that. And yet you do it to me all the time. One of the things, Troy, that I found very interesting is, and I discovered it quickly on, I found out how many of you dealt with it. Now, not you, because I've seen some of your things and they're excellent. But I found out that people like to read numbers. So you would go, well, the high temperature today, they start reading numbers, and then they'd tell them to wrap, okay, out of here. All right. So you could read more numbers or you could read lead down numbers, and it didn't really make any difference. You bailed right out of there. Okay. So I learned, but I never yielded to that. I from the time for 21 years that I was there, I always tried to approach it that I was a reporter giving a weather report rather than reading numbers. But Troy, let me tell you one of the reasons, and this will be of interest, I think, to the rest of you. One of the reasons I believe why I gained such support here in the Houston area is I went out and gave talks.
Yeah.
The first year I was here, I gave 125 talks. And that was all on my own time. Now, you would appreciate that. I would give a luncheon talk, then go to work in the afternoon. Or we'd give our 6 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and I would go out and give a talk in the evening. So I gave over almost 2,000 talks while I was here. I went to little communities, I went to big communities, I went to big distinguished groups. I went, if you had 10 people in the evening, I'd go out and give you a talk. Well, that really, I think, was effective. And I'm not sure that my predecessor and others have really appreciated how important it is to get out and do the chicken green bean circuit. Okay. But I used to remember that one of the news directors we had, Neil, why are you going out? There's only 25 people. Why are you wasting your time? And I said, that's 25 people that we don't have as viewers. Right. Now you go on the air and you have 500,000 viewers. Yeah, but there are regular viewers. So I would be out and relating to these people. And I tell you, you go to the little small towns around Houston and give a talk, you made an impact.
Well,
I wish everybody in television weather could just listen to what this man just said. That these are words of wisdom. But most people won't do it. They're just lazy. They won't do it.
James, one thing too, and Neil too, is I found out pretty quickly is there's nothing that's a good ratings capture than going out and talking to first and second graders about science, because it gets to the house.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and parents will tune in a second. And not that I did it necessarily for that reason. It didn't hurt anything. But I always found that first and second graders were the most honest with you. They're the people that won't lie to you that much. Kids will tell you the truth.
Troy, let me tell you what my experience like that was. When I first got here, I accepted a number of commitments to go to schools. Yeah. And then I was swamped. I got 350 requests in 1 year to go to schools. How do you do it and do it fairly? And if I went to one, then other parents would call and say, well, you went to their school. So we decided I wouldn't go to school. But you know what I did in 2 weeks? We produced a video on why weather. And then when a teacher would call in, hey, we've got this video. And so we sent this video out, I think 3,000 or 4,000 of those videos out to teachers. Well, the kids still see it. All right.
Yeah.
But I didn't have to be there. And again, I think that's one of the best things that we've ever done.
Yeah.
I've often told when when we have some kind of a major news event, we send our senior anchors over to Russia or someplace like that, and they come back and they have 2 or 3 programs and that's it. I said, why don't you put that program together and send it down to the library so they can loan it out to the schools, and you would get the visibility. But that didn't ever seem to take off. Again, I think that that's a mistake that we've made in television.
Dr. Frank, I'm curious, your career and everything that you've seen, and now in this modern era, social media and everything that's going on with all the distractions and the noise that's out there, and we still have hurricanes. Max told me early on in my career that, Max Mayfield, of course, that, the hurricanes are not going to quit because we have problems. They're going to keep coming. So in 2021, what keeps you up at night if you think about it? What is the scenario that kind of gives you chills that could happen, even as connected as we are? Is there still something that could come in and really smack this country and set us back a piece?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that. You can have these surprises, these meteorological surprises. And Ida was a prime example of that. Look how fast it strengthened as it approached coastline. And so those are the things that are nightmares for me. In the Gulf Coast, it's rapid strengthening right on the coastline. Now, this isn't something that's just happened recently. I can go back to 83 in Alicia. It doubled in strength before making landfall. Look back to 1970 in Hurricane Celia. It doubled in strength before making landfall in Corpus Christi and just tore that place apart. Or you go back to 1935, the strongest hurricane that's ever hit the United States was a Category 5, the lowest pressure that's ever been observed in one of our coastal stations. It was a tropical storm in Andros Island. 36 hours later, it was the strongest hurricane that we've ever hit. So rapid strengthening is not something that just happened recently, although Ida is an example of that. And the other storm that went to Mexico City, that's the M storm?
Michael.
Yeah, Michael was another example of that. But this isn't something that's just all of a sudden we're aware of and we're seeing more of. I don't think so. I just think that rapid and strengthening storms have been with us forever. And when it happens right along the coastline, you got a problem. Now, up the East Coast, the thing that worries me most is something that would accelerate in its forward speed. Hazel in 1954 was a classic example of that. When it went across the Carolina coast, it was moving 50 miles an hour. 1938, 38 was the one that hit Long Island. It was moving forward. The forward speed was 50 miles an hour when that storm crossed Long Island. There's no way that you can evacuate people with a storm moving that fast. So those are the two nightmares. In the Gulf, it's rapid intensity. Up the East Coast, it's fast motion.
This is also interesting to listen to, both from the weather science perspective. I know all of us have different hats we wear in that. I personally do a lot now in weather risk communication, and I think about things like evacuation. And I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about when you were doing all of this at the Hurricane Center. How much lead time could you give to foster things like evacuation? Did we do evacuations? Did we have enough of a forecast to really make something like that work? We take so much for granted today. What did that look like early in your career, and what did you see it? I'm sure you saw several evolutions of that over time.
Yeah, when I first joined the Hurricane Center, if we gave you 12 hours of notice, we thought that was sufficient. Then see, when I became the director, and asked this question about how many people living along the coastline have ever experienced a major hurricane, I went to the emergency managers and not one community had an evacuation study. We didn't know. So we finagled around and bootlegged some data off of some of our computers, and we provided storm surge information. With the first community was on the West Coast in the Fort Myers area. And we found out that it took 22 hours to evacuate that community and those communities along there. 12 hours isn't sufficient. So from that, we completed evacuation studies in all the coastal areas. And some of the numbers are frightening.
Yeah.
New Orleans, for example, is a frightening number, between 25 and 30 hours to evacuate everyone that would need to be evacuated. At least we know now. And so we know that we're going to try to stretch our skills to provide as much lead time as we can for evacuation. But I'll tell you, if those rapid intensifying storms right on the coastline, we're not going to give you that kind of a lead time to evacuate. And so you're asking an extremely important question and an extremely difficult one to solve.
Yeah, I'm
Hey,
sure
Neil,
that was. Oh, sorry.
I'm
Go
sorry,
ahead,
Kim.
James.
Go ahead. Go. You go.
I was just going to wrap with a quick follow up where, you know, one of the things that we need to think about in trying to get people to evacuate too is just communicating with them. And I think one of, you know, in addition to having the forecast lead time, like you were talking about, to address the amount of time needed to just physically move everybody out of there, you also need to be sure that this messaging is getting out to people. And you know, from what you've described, it sounds like there was very little societal awareness along the coast of what hurricanes even were. I mean, that you know, what the hazards were involved in that. So if you were to try to say something like a hurricane is coming, you know, were there broadcasters who knew what that meant even? I mean, a lot of weather forecasters at the time, or I should say broadcast meteorologists, were meteorologists with scare quotes. You know, they weren't even trained meteorologists. They were TV personalities. Right. Were messages disseminable, you know, in a timely fashion? Or were you up against something difficult there too, with a broadcast sector that wasn't even particularly sophisticated on the science, and maybe even aware of what these hazards were? You know, you're talking about emergency planning for getting people out, but I think that's even a best case scenario, that you have the right people who believe the message to begin with to pass it along. What was that like when you were at the Hurricane Center?
Well, see, you're addressing the concern that I had when I became director, and that's changed my career from doing research and publishing papers in research journals. All of a sudden, I was out communicating, and I'm not a natural communicator, but I found myself there doing that kind of thing, exactly the point that you're trying to make people aware of what the hurricane is and what they need to do to take action. And for emergency managers, at least know how long it takes to evacuate everybody. Some of the emergency managers I found were very limited in their skills. We used to have workshops for emergency managers as well as the media that would come in. And I can't tell you how many times we had to train an emergency manager to plot latitude and longitude so they could identify the hurricane on their weather map. Okay. And so most emergency managers, it's a secondary task. Now, maybe the major cities, it's okay. But in a minor city, it's not a major task. And so we have big problems. We still have those problems today. I don't mean to imply that they've been solved, but at least we're aware of them and we're trying to address them.
Hey, Neil, let me ask you a question. Is it time to replace the Saffir-Simpson scale?
No, I have an
why not?
I have an entirely different view on that. The Saffir-Simpson scale is a scale that tips people off to the dangers. Now, when you say it's a category 3, I don't think people are thinking that the winds are 110 miles an hour and the storm surge is going to be so and so. I think that they say, whoa, a category 3 is something I better pay attention to. Pay attention to category 4 or 5. The Saffir-Simpson scale was initiated in the late 60s when I was there. And down through the years, people have become accustomed to it. I never intended for people to use in the warnings and say this is a category 3 because it can change. But at least we're able to communicate something effectively. This is more dangerous than something else, right? So in that way, I think that the Saffir-Simpson scale was very effective. I don't think you have to break down whether it's the wind or whether it's the storm surge as they're trying to do today. I just think that they're misusing the Saffir-Simpson scale. I think it's been something that's been there. I think that people relate to it. I think people do respond to it, and therefore is an effective communication tool. You see what I mean? Let me tell you an interesting story. Gordon Dunn. I went over to Pakistan after the great disaster over there in 1970 killed probably 500,000 people. And one of the UN agencies asked me to go over there and be a consultant and see if we couldn't improve their warning service. So I got over there and I found out that Gordon Dunn, my predecessor, had been there 10 years before. And he said, "Oh, your communication skill is really too difficult. Nobody understands it." They had a program of 1 to 10. A 1, 2, 3 meant that you had a weak hurricane passing to the right of you, directly over you, or to the left of you. 2, 3, 3, 4, and 5 means you have a moderate storm. One thing they did know is when you hit 10, man, you rang the bell, time to move, okay? He said it's too complicated. Nobody knows what a 4 is. Nobody knows what a 7 is. He said you've got to simplify it. Make it just 3 numbers, 1, 2, 3. So they sounded the alarm in 1970. This is a category 3. All of you need to take action. When I got over there, I said, nobody said it was a 10. We didn't know that it was a 10. You see, they had been accustomed to this system for years, and they had adjusted to it, and they knew when you rang the bell at 10, hey, well, I need to take action. Well, it's kind of that same thing with the Saffir Simpson scale. When you have a 3, 4, or 5, people are not particularly zeroing in on whether the height of the storm versus the height of the wind. They're saying, hey, 3 is worse than a 2, and 4 is worse than a 3. And if it's a 5, it's a bell ringer. Let's get out of here. And so I think that the Saffir Simpson screw can be used as a communication device if we would stop worrying about the meteorology of it.
So in your career at the National Hurricane Center, Dr. Frank, what was your best forecast? The one forecast that verified and saved lives, the one you're proud of, the number one top forecast?
Oh, I don't think that I could zero that in. I had too many misses.
Well, my next question is what was your biggest bust? What was the biggest struggle?
Well, I remember when Eloise was approaching the Florida Panhandle. Was it 76?
75, 1975.
Yeah, 75.
September
It was
23rd.
right up towards the Panhandle, and all of a sudden the eye jumped 60 miles further west. I still don't know why it did that, but that was probably the biggest miss. And of course, Alicia, we didn't do very well on that because we got behind it. When it doubled in strength, we told them that now it's a category 3, but so be it. They didn't have time to take my action. So Eloise, I remember, and Alicia, I remember. And I still don't know why Eloise jumped 60 miles further west, but the radar show it doing that.
I was actually on the Gulf Coast for Eloise. I was in college. I had my ham radio gear. That's my hobby, and still today is ham radio. And we were in the Alabama Gulf Coast. We had to shift about 50 miles because of the same situation in the middle of that thing, in the middle of the night.
That's right.
That was a pretty rough ride, but we made it. But let me just say one comment before I turn it back over to Bill. You mentioned earlier that you're not a good communicator. I would disagree. I think you are an astounding communicator.
Absolutely.
You have a passion for communicating the message, for the science, and people can read that and they would pay attention to you. When you came on national television, I mean, everybody would stop and listen to what you had to say. So you are the Elvis of hurricane specialist. I mean, you're good. So don't ever sell yourself short on your communication skill. You are good.
Well, the passion is there because I realized that life were at stake and maybe I could have an impact. And somehow if I could communicate that to them, maybe people would take action and save their life. So there's been no question about the passion. But in terms of the English language and the vocabulary and stumbling over words, yeah, I plead guilty.
It's so funny, Dr. Frank, tonight in your answers, I can hear you answering from the Hurricane Center, on the major networks or on the Weather Channel. It's just amazing. You still got it. after all these years. So did you enjoy your time at KHOU more, or your time at the Hurricane Center more?
Oh, at the Hurricane Center, because that was a professional job. The thing is, let me explain.
Love it.
Oh yeah.
There's not a lot you can do in 3 minutes or less.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that was what was so disturbing, and particularly when you got cut on your time, so it was very frustrating. Now, in terms of the environment that I was in, I was giving over 100 talks a year. So that was the part that was really satisfying, that I could go out and talk to people on Galveston or talk to people that could be flooded. So that passion was still there as I went out and spoke to these groups. But on the air, it was a very difficult thing for me to adjust to that time frame.
Well, we certainly weren't making light of your answer. We're just telling James. We always tell him all the time he's the consummate professional, but sometimes we have to remind him that he's got to get that head through a door. But I wanted to ask you about, when you talked about the hurricane scale, and you mentioned earlier that we catch a lot of storms we don't catch now, but some people think that, that's a bad thing, that we name so many storms, have so many subtropical storms. What do you think about that?
Oh, there's no question about it. There's been a change in the philosophy of what we name. And one of the, 2020, 30 named storms, never seen anything like that. Why it's unbelievable. It's got to be global warming that's causing this increase in storms. Let me tell you a couple of reasons why we had a big increase in 2020. And so far, we're right on track now. We're 19. And we aren't past October yet, okay? There's no question that we're in a period when there is an increase in hurricane activity. Remember, I talked to you earlier that when the earth warms, you get an increase in the number of hurricanes. We're in a period when the earth is warmed, and therefore we're seeing an increase in the number of hurricanes that has nothing to do with global warming, apart from the fact that we are warmer than we were in the little ice age 150 years ago, okay? So we've warmed the last 150 years. That's not debatable. And that is being manifested in the number of hurricanes. But how about the satellites? Remember, I told you that we're naming 3 storms on the average over in the Eastern Atlantic. Well, in 2020, we named 5 storms in the Eastern Atlantic. This year so far, we've named 3 that would have never got over into the Western Atlantic. But without question, the reason that we had 30 named storms in 2020 is because there's been a change, a major change in the philosophy of warning and naming these storms that form in what I call the subtropical Atlantic. In other words, north of 25-degree latitude, north of the latitude of Miami. The deep tropics, I think, would be south of that. Then the subtropical Atlantic would be north of that. Before we had satellites, we were naming less than 1 storm a year up there. In 2020, we named 10. We named 1 storm within 6 hours of making landfall in Portugal. Look, they've got 5 meteorological services over. Why are we naming storms that cross the coastline of Portugal? It's unreal. We're naming everything that moves up there today. And because
why are they doing that, Neil?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, we do have satellites that are better than we had 15, 20 years ago. In other words, you can use a satellite and actually determine the wind. So they look down and they see this wind. They said, we better name that. Let me go into, if I can, if you'll give me a few more minutes here, I'll explain the difference between the storms that form in the deep tropics and the one that forms in the subtropics. And I think you'll understand a little bit about what I'm talking about. In the deep tropics, it's African disturbances that are so important. We track 40 or 50 of these a year, and something in the order of 10 or 12 of those become our named storms. Before we had satellites, 75 to 80% of the storms were formed by African disturbances. Now, the energy process is very simple. The African disturbance moves off the coast. It causes thunderstorms. The thunderstorms heat the atmosphere. The hot air rises and it's replaced at the surface. And if the winds become strong enough, we put a name on it. Very simple. To kill it, you kill the thunderstorms. Now let's go into the subtropics. The storms that form there form on dissipating cold fronts or low pressure systems, cold lows in the upper part of the atmosphere that bore all the way down to the surface. But let's talk about the more common thing. We have a cold front that moves off the coastline in the spring, and even sometimes in the summer and the fall. A little weather disturbance forms along this front. And this typically occurs just off of the southeast coast of the United States. And as it begins to move along, satellite shows that there's a bunch of thunderstorms there. Oh, the thunderstorms are now going to heat this thing, and you have the hot air rising. So you have a mix of energy process. You have the process where you have cold and warm air. That is the standard way that this thing got formed. And then you got the thunderstorms that is now morphing this system to a tropical storm. Look, it has a look of a tropical storm. So we put a name on it. And then the system moves into higher latitudes, and we run into cold air, and the thunderstorms dissipate, so we dename it. We take the name off from it, even though we still have a gale warning going into the North Atlantic. Why did we name it? 5 storms this year have been named, and they have an average lifetime of 18 hours. We put a name on it. 18 hours later, we take the name off from it, and here goes that storm into the North Atlantic. Well, in 2030, we named 10 storms in the North Atlantic. You know how many storms we named there in 1933? 0.
Mm-hmm.
We had 21 named storms in 1933. Almost all of them came out of Africa. Mm-hmm. The tropics were boiling. We didn't name any storms in the Eastern Atlantic. I still think that 1933 may be historically more an active season than 2020.
Yeah.
We're just naming too many things up there. Now, I don't necessarily criticize the Hurricane Center. I mean, they observe winds. Okay, put a name on it. But if I was a ship captain out there and I come drifting along and, ooh, there's a name on this, I better be careful. Then tomorrow they take the name off from it. My reaction is, well, it's not too dangerous. I don't have to worry about it. No, the winds are still 50 miles an hour. They're blowing around a cold core rather than a warm core.
Dr. Frank, I have one more for you, unless anybody else has anything. Recently, the Hurricane Center got a little criticism on social media for some kind of humorous headlines in their advisories. Did you have any advisories ever that you had a little fun with somewhere in the headline?
No, we didn't stress a lot of the headlines when I was at the Hurricane Center. If we did, it was basically meteorological. We didn't mess around with the headlines.
Well, it's just been an amazing conversation with you. Anybody else want to jump in? If not, James, you can take us to the recorded segments. But anybody else? Neil Jacobs going once, going twice. Mark Suturf, did you have anything you want to add? I know you're providing these incredible camera shots now from the coast, and I think what you did in Hurricane Michael was literally amazing in helping people see what was going on in the eye wall of that Category 5 hurricane.
Yeah, point blank range. I'm actually working on a project. I'll talk about that. I just want to, one thing, Dr. Frank, and he's right about, I mean, certainly he is. Who am I to tell him he's right? About the naming, et cetera. But let's remember, like this year, Henri started from a cold core and then transitioned into a hurricane, pretty bona fide hurricane structurally. Yep. And Joaquin in 2015, similar. Right. Hurricane Diana, 1984, my first real hurricane experience. Some of them will do that. But then you have these ones way up in the northern latitudes, and they're, the tropopause is different, and there's a lot of instability. And I get that part. Maybe there should be a different convention so that the people that like to take this and say, ooh, 30 named storms, we all need to drive horse and buggies from now on to stop that. That part is no bueno. And I agree with that. that it is getting out of control from a group of people that like to sort of take that and run with it. But yeah, I do remember, because I was on Long Island, I was in Montauk for Henri and seeing it on radar. And I remember Joaquin in 2015, and some of these do become, and I'm sure there's other ones in history, just incredibly intense hurricanes where they make that transition all the way over. I don't know what the solution is, but it is an interesting observation from someone that started all of this before I was even born. And we appreciate that.
Well, I don't want to discredit the fact that you can get a hurricane formed from a cold low in the upper part of the atmosphere that bores all the way down. As a matter of fact, when I was at the Hurricane Center, we figured that maybe 1 or 2 storms a year would form that way. But the thing they're naming today, well, they're still naming those kind of storms. I don't mean, and that's legitimate. And even some of these that form along the front will go ahead and develop into something that becomes more serious. But the thing that I'm really concerned about is by naming all these storms, we've really messed up the historical records. And if you I'm of the opinion that the only way that you can legitimately say anything about hurricanes in the Atlantic is to take it landfalling major hurricanes in the lower 48. Now, a major hurricane would be 3, 4, 5. See, I'll concede to you in the 1800s that a tropical storm or a category 1 could make landfall in a remote area and it might not be recorded. But I venture to say that a category 3, 4, or 5 is in the record books, even back into the 1800s. And so I think this gives us a legitimate indication of what the trend is in hurricanes in the Atlantic. And there's been no increase in that. None at all. As a matter of fact, there might be a slight decrease. The major landfalls that took place in the United States were in the 40s and the 50s. Florida got hit by 11 hurricanes. 7 of those were major in the Florida in the 40s, and the Carolinas got hit by 6 in the 50s. We've not seen anything like that in recent years. And I think that there has not been a trend in the hurricane activities in the Atlantic, even though the raw data now would say, whoa, a historical record. Okay.
Right. Good point.
All right, Jen, you wanted to ask something, then Troy, I think you wanted to say something, and then we'll toss it back to James.
Yeah, I'm going to take it in a different direction here, but I watched some podcasts with you on there and heard a little bit more about your story and your beliefs, and your belief in Christianity. And we're actually going to have an author on in November. Is it Peter Thusen? Is that how you say it, Bill? They wrote a book about violent weather and American religion. And the discussion is about why would a loving God allow such evil like hurricanes and tornadoes to happen? So we wanted to get, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, let's start with, I don't want to talk about tornadoes, that's difficult. But let's talk about hurricanes.
Right.
We have a hurricane problem today because we're building in vulnerable areas. I was not sure that God ever intended for us to locate on the beachfront at Galveston Island. It's a barrier island. It's there to protect the mainland. And so we go out there and build along all these barrier islands, and then we have a hurricane problem. Well, it's a partially man-made hurricane problem. You understand what I'm saying? If we would live in harmony with God's laws, we could minimize that kind of problem. I'm not, for along the creek bank or along a river, right down on the waterfront. Well, it's going to flood sometime. Why aren't we up on the hill? Now, tornado is a different problem. I don't want to talk about that. That is, I don't have any explanation for that.
Well, before we toss it to Troy, I want to thank you so much. It's been a history lesson. We could talk to you all night long, and it's just been so wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you so much for sharing as much as you have, and we appreciate it greatly. So, Troy, over to
Jen,
you. Experience, right?
And thank you, Jen, for helping to get Dr. Neil Frank. And I'll tell you, this gentleman, Neil, you say you're not a communicator. I'm with James. I think you're the expert. And I just say how enjoyable tonight's been, and for you to give your time and tell your story tonight has just, I don't know what to say. This has been a really amazing hour and a half.
Thank you.
Hey, Troy, one time, I want to say this was about 1981 or 82. I was in Slidell, Louisiana at some weather conference. And along the sidewalk, I noticed come walking beside me was Dr. Neil Frank. I mean, I almost melted down. I was so excited. I mean, I can't believe it. I mean, this is like Neil Frank. He's right beside me. And Dr. Frank, you were the kindest I was pretty young and scared to death, and you were so kind and so encouraging. An encouraging word goes a long way. So thank you for your kindness on that day, and thanks for your leadership. I mean, it's an honor to have you on the show. And I've got to figure out what is the deal with this fountain of youth. I mean, what you look no different now than you looked 40 years ago. What's the secret for us old people that are not going down your path here?
Well, let me tell you, Velma and I both turned 90 this year. She's 6 months older than I am, as a matter of fact. And we've been married 69 years, but I dated 5 years before that. So we're coming close to our 75th anniversary of being together. And all I can tell you is God has been good. Our health has been good. And we just rejoice in the life that he's permitted us to live. It's been exciting.
Wow. Well, Dr. Frank, thank you so much. And again, you're welcome to stay. We're going to hit a couple of recorded segments. We're going to come back and do picks of the week and the weather roundup, and we'll talk about Sam and the tropical activity. So if you need to go, you take off. But if you can stay, we'd love to have you. We do have to pause for a moment. We got Tony Rice with his astronomy report. We've got Jen with This Week in Tornado History. We'll come back with the weather roundup, picks of the week, and much more as WeatherBrains rolls along.
Looking beyond the atmosphere, here's Tony Rice with your astronomy outlook.
NASA launched the latest in its longest-lasting program this morning. No, not the ISS. That's only been up there for 20 years. Not even the Voyager program that dates back to the launch of Voyager 1 in 1977. I'm talking about the joint NASA-U.S. Geologic Survey Landsat program, which dates back to Landsat 1 in 1972. This morning's launch of Landsat 9 from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California ensures that the nearly 50 years of continuous images will continue to grow. And it's that longevity that is the key to its value. Beginning with Landsat 3 back in the late 70s, all this data has been made available for free to anyone who needs it. Back then, that was several dozen countries who used it to track their natural resources. Today, you see Landsat data in applications like Google Earth or NASA's Whirlwind server. Data from Landsat has also been used to guide resources following natural disasters. Most recently, Landsat 8 spotted oil slicks above the submarine pipelines off the Louisiana coast, and also measured the impact of flooding following Hurricane Ida. Here in North Carolina, Landsat data was used after hurricanes, not just to track where the flooding was occurring, but water quality issues as sediment and debris choked rivers and streams as those floodwaters receded. And all that flooding data helps predict how and where future flooding events will have impact. It's also been used to help farmers in Northern California cut water use there in half by irrigating only when their crops really need it. Instruments on the ground have measured how much water was evaporating from the ground and transpiring from plants to further fine-tune the satellite imagery. Landsat has also been invaluable to climate research, tracking movement and melting of glaciers in Antarctica and Greenland, as well as sea and river ice. It's your astronomy outlook. Follow me at RTP Hokie for more spacey stuff like this.
This week in tornado history, September 30th, 1959. A devastating F3 tornado struck portions of Virginia on this day. It was produced by the remnants of Hurricane Gracie. For an overview from the Weather Prediction Center, Gracie became a hurricane on September 22nd, 1959, near the Bahamas. It tracked into the southern coast of South Carolina as a major hurricane late in the morning of the 30th. For the Tornado Project online, Gracie produced a total of 7 tornadoes. 4 occurred on September 30th. There was an estimated F1 in Horry County, South Carolina, and 3 estimated F3 tornadoes in Virginia. Per Thomas Grzoulis, one of the F3s moved eastward from Meacham's River near Crozet to Ivy, 6 miles west of Charlottesville. 2 houses were destroyed at Crozet. At Ivy, a tragic event occurred at a duplex that was used as the apple picker's bunkhouse. 10 members of the Irvin Morris family died at this location. The ages of the victims ranged from 7 months to 48 years old. A woman died at a nearby house. Mrs. Lily Bruce was killed when a chimney fell on her. Her husband and son survived. It was reported that a paid-up banknote was carried from Meacham's River to near Lacey Springs, a good 50 miles away. We are working on an update to our summary about this event, and that'll be out later this week on tornadotalk.com.
All right, thanks, Jen. So let's do a weather roundup. We've got Dr. Neil Frank on the show. I think Dr. Frank should give us a tropical update right now. This is like our John Hope moment here. Doc Frank, do you still keep up with the tropics? Do you watch it every day?
Oh, absolutely. And I've been watching this big storm, Sam, that's out there. I don't think it's going to affect us here in the U.S., but I try to keep up. So when somebody has a question, well, I can respond to them. And this has been an active hurricane season. I'm not disputing that, but we're naming a whole bunch of things in the North Atlantic, and those are questionable.
Yeah, I think we probably got 9 storms that were junks. I call them junk storms. Right. I mean, you know, they get a name, they go away. They're high latitude, but we do have a couple of pretty good looking waves coming off the African coast in the far eastern Atlantic that look interesting. Have you been watching those?
Absolutely. Well, I told you we followed 40 to 50 of those a year. And yeah. I think I told you earlier, I was the first one that tracked storms all the way from Africa to the Caribbean with satellite pictures. Incidentally, let me mention Ida, because Ida has gotten a lot of attention because it should. It was a major storm there in Louisiana. But see, nobody in the media has said that they had a similar storm in 1893. There was as a matter of fact, I think it was on Grand Isle, 3,000, maybe 2,000 people died in that storm. And in 1856, there was another storm that hit that same area. And there was an island down there that goes by the English version, Lost Isle. Well, it was completely disappeared. And there was a very, very exclusive hotel for rich people to come down there and spend the summer on that island. So they've had big storms on that coastline before Ida.
Yeah, that 1856 hurricane was always fascinating to me because there was a great book in our library about it, that Last Island disaster.
That's it.
And that really is an amazing, an amazing storm, because those folks really, the only warnings they had were the brick red sunset the night before and the pounding surf, like Isaac Klein saw in Galveston. Yeah. In 1900. So, Mark Suturf, that's a good chance for you to talk about Ida, which is a main reason we had you here tonight. Talk about your experiences down there, putting out your cameras and sensors in front of that storm.
Ida was, sort of part of this big flurry of activity that started there after mid-August, and I was gone for Fred, for Henri, and then down to the coast there for Ida in Louisiana, where I've been a lot since 2020. I mean, I'm getting mail and Amazon packages in Louisiana now. It's ridiculous. Met a lot of Cajuns and a lot of incredible people, but man, they've been beat up. So for Ida, had a really successful deployment of taking the best technology that we've ever had, thanks to this crowdfunding that has really grown since 2018. Michael was a big benchmark, and I think really helped in a lot of ways for my project that's been going on since 2005. This idea of putting cameras out to watch where we have no business being, and it spreads the eyes and the ears around, but most importantly, the eyes can only be in one place at one time. If you're a hurricane chaser with a camera, and with these unmanned cameras, we can be wherever we want to be. It's only limited by the budget and the manpower. So for Ida, we had 13 live cams and 2 of these GoPro cams that record only to back up those live cams. And one of those cameras, the recorded cams, happened to be over in Laplace area at Frenier Landing. So I hopefully can share my screen, and I'm going to show you this. Let's see if you can enable me, if that would be possible. I can share my screen.
Oh, okay. I think we can do that. And be sure and describe it in detail for those that are listening.
Will do. Thank you. I appreciate it. So let's see here. I want to go to the folder. Perfect. All right. So do you see the PDF file? Everybody seeing that? Fantastic. So the PDF file here is our version of a tropical cyclone report. And I just want to kind of scroll down and show you a little bit about where we deployed our assets all the way from Gulf.
We're just seeing we see the icon. We don't actually see the file.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So let me just go and we'll just do video instead because it's trying to share that in a different. So let me bring me back so I can set this up and then we're going to show the video. So I'll just describe it. We set up cameras from Gulfport, Mississippi down to Golden Meadow and a lot of points in between. And 13 of those cameras were live. 2 of them were augmented with these GoPro cameras up on Lake Pontchartrain. That's where I was most concerned about storm surge from my experiences down there and so forth. We also had 2 weather stations. And when I say weather stations, we had the pressure sensors and the anemometers, the Armstrong anemometers. Those were placed on the sides of these bridges using these clamp systems that we have integrated. And one was in Homa and the other one was over on the 310 Hale Boggs Bridge on top of the Mississippi River coming out of New Orleans. And both of those, a lot of stories here, both of those weather stations, because of this weird vibration that went through the anemometer and into this clamp system, it backed out those screws that clamps it on. It's an incredible thing to see in time lapse. It looks like a ghost turning these screws out, and they both flipped off and fell off the bridges. It was a loss. But we learned from it, and that's a whole other story. The cameras, though, were remarkable. And so what I want to do, I want to just screen share this and show you what this looked like from the perspective of these cameras. So this is the GoPro, and let's mute the audio there. So you should see me, and we're setting up the camera there. This is midnight.
Hey, Mark, we're still seeing with the folder with the icons and not the actual video.
Strange. How do we, let's see, go back. Oh yeah. So let's do this. Let's get that playing. We're going to figure this out. And if not, I'll have to describe it. Oh, there we go. Now you should see it.
Okay.
Bingo.
Yeah.
All right.
We have a winner.
We have a winner. And I empathize with Dr. Frank about technology. I tell you. All right. So I'm glad it's working. So there's me. I'm setting it up. This is the moment the GoPro went live. This is Frenier landing. We put the GoPro up. And that's the landing. The GoPro, you got to understand, this is 11 feet above ground level, right there on the west-southwest side of Lake Pontchartrain and near Laplace at Frenier Landing. And so this is midnight plus 30 minutes or so on August 29th. And so let's skip ahead to the next day. Now we're just a little bit after sunrise. Water has come up. Ida has become almost a Category 5, very intense hurricane. It's going to make landfall down near Grand Isle, as we know. All of our live cams are watching from just a huge area, really remarkable. But this GoPro really captured something remarkable. And remember, it's 11 feet above the ground level. So we move ahead several more hours. Now the surge is really starting to roll in there off of Lake Pontchartrain. It's come up 3 or 4 feet. And you can see the wind acting on the surface of the water. Very remarkable, very clear. Again, the use of this technology to see something, not only this interesting, educational, but there's a lot of science in here. There's a lot of understanding how this works. And I'm so just taken aback by that, going back to some of my early stuff and 15 years ago to this. This is the peak. It's now at the level of our live cam, which was about a foot below the GoPro box. The live cam is just a Nest cam that's streaming through a hotspot and a big battery that backs it up. And the water is actually hitting the live cam and submerging it a little bit. And look, you can actually see how that water does a lot of things. It's pushing the water itself. The wind is pushing the water. But, and Dr. Frank knows about this, those hurricanes take that, especially in the core, they take the water and just whip it right up into that core. Like literally, into this weird particle almost. It's like into an extremely fine mist, that top layer of the ocean and the intense cores. And you can almost see that here. This was not quite an intense core. It's in the right front quadrant of Ida at this point, but you can see that, how it just acts to wick that moisture right off the surface of that very warm Lake Pontchartrain. I bet that was pushing 30, 31 Celsius at the time. And that's part of this science I'm talking about, that you can see the process at work. And you can look at this and say, why wouldn't you evacuate that? So the camera systems, again, really paid off in showing us something truly remarkable in Hurricane Ida. But even though we lost the anemometers right near the peak there, and they were recording 90, 100 mile per hour winds, and then they both fell off the bridges. One of them we recovered, and we'll get it repaired from Armyung, and we'll move on. But the pressure sensors that we put out there, they all did really well. And we were able to record air pressures all around the area. That gives us a good idea of the gradient. And as you all know, of course, I'm preaching to the choir, but that difference in the pressure over distance, so important, because pressure is so much easier to measure than wind. Wind measurements, and Dr. Frank, I'll tell you, this is hard. University of Florida, Dr. Masters, Forrest Masters, and his group set up a wind tower in the middle of that big field area out near Tyndall Air Force Base, between Tyndall and Mexico Beach, and the wind blew it over. They had a little mishap with the way it was sighted, and they got defeated. It's hard, and that's a big 10-meter, 6,000 pound, and it's Dr. Masters and his group. I mean, they are fantastic, and even they have these setbacks. Wind is freaking hard to measure. These hurricanes want to come in and just knock everything over. They don't care that I'm there trying to measure it, but we're going to continue to move forward. And we've learned from it. We've talked to some engineers and some physicists. You put stuff on YouTube, and I know that James knows, the kooks that come out, and you get a lot of kooky responses. But once in a while, you can sift through that, and an occasional legit engineer or physicist will tell you what is happening, why the thing failed, and we've learned from it. And when we get back out again, we've crowdfunded all the equipment back that we lost. I'll say this too: we lost our stuff during Katrina when I started this project 16 years ago. All three of these original boxes, which were the sizes of foot lockers back then, now it's the size of you can see that yellow one. This is it right here. That's the box. That is it. That's what we put out there. The GoPro, my wife always says they look like something. She says, that's $500. It looks like you got it out of a Cracker Jack. And I'm like, yes, but it can help solve the mysteries of the universe if it'll just work. And it's come a long way since the defeat of Katrina, because Katrina washed away all three of our camera systems. And, it took all the way to Michael for me to sort of redeem myself, if you will. And that was incredible. But then Ida was another opportunity here to really learn. I've shared this with the National Hurricane Center. I've shared this stuff with Dr. Klotzbach. He shared it with colleagues, and we're learning. We're still learning. We're still learning from stuff, from 3 years ago from Michael. But Ida was just another one of these, again, as Dr. Frank talked about, this intensifying hurricane right up to landfall. But you know what? It was well forecast. If you all remember that, it was explicitly talked about in the discussions, as lengthy as they can be these days. And I will say this real quick to go back just a minute, and you can just tell how much I'm passionate about hurricanes myself. Three things. One, I think Dr. Frank's communications are because he had the flat top and he looked like
yeah. Yeah.
You thought, I need to listen to that guy because he looks like he's from the right stuff or something. There was just something about that. The flat top commanded respect. Two, and I'm going to lose my train of thought. What was I going to say? I got lost on the flat top thing. So Ida, Katrina, wow, and he remembers everything, and he's 40 years older than me, and I have forgotten what the heck I was going to say.
We were talking about discussions, the forecast,
yes,
the hurricane discussions.
You bailed me out. Thank you, Jennifer.
You're welcome.
They are long, and Dr. Pash, when you see his, you don't even have to to see at the bottom forecaster pass, you know who wrote it because it's 3 paragraphs. When it's 9 paragraphs, it's usually Stacy Stewart. So there's that. It's all good. So, but the initial forecast, to my point, for Ida, similar to one last year, I don't remember if it was Ada or Iota. I mean, we're talking Greek letters here. It's crazy, but it was like the most rapid intensification or something in the initial forecast ever, or something was last year in one of those Greek names. And I think Ida was very similar, that they explicitly said, this is going to rapidly intensify. We're very certain of it. And that's exactly what happened. Yet still, a lot of people stayed down on Grand Isle and anywhere in between. And, Louisiana is just a huge sponge that has been put down there to absorb water, and we live on it. We drill into it. Beautiful area, great people. They are hardy souls. They don't complain and cry about stuff. They just pick themselves up and move forward. If they do complain or cry, they do it behind closed doors. I'm convinced of it. But boy, they have been through a lot lately. And I felt like it was a privilege for my team and I to go down and set this stuff up and try to capture a little piece of that history to show people later on. And I do the same kinds of talks that Dr. Frank did, and all of you do talks in one way or the other. James does it through television these days and on social media, and you reach a lot more people that way. And that kind of stuff helps in the future, that I can show people what storm surge is all about, that demystifies it just a little bit and maybe motivates them to take some action. So Ida, very successful. A shame that people have to go through that, but you know what? If they're gonna hit land, I want to be there with this equipment, and I'm very grateful for the people that support it, that I'm able to do exactly what I feel like I was born to do in terms of a career.
Well, Mark, I think that anybody who might be inclined to stay in the face of an advancing hurricane, if they watch your video from Mexico Beach, or your video from Laplace, or John Humphreys's video from Grand Isle, which is all 3 of those, are frightening. We used to have to read about this stuff in books. We read about Hurricane Audrey in 1957, right before, Dr. Frank got to the Hurricane Center. But, you read these stories of the people, in Cameron that were out there floating on trees or whatever, trying to survive the wind. And now you see it live in your video. I think I've never been as shocked by video as I was by your Mexico Beach video from Hurricane Michael. And I hope you're getting it in the hands of as many people as you can.
I am, and I'm working on a project just to talk about that real quick. It's called the Michael Project. I did a documentary about it that was like a 2-hour movie, and I've put that on Amazon and on YouTube, freely available. But it's, it's a cinematic, it's edited, and the raw video, nobody's ever seen that in its entirety except me, because it's hours long. From the moment we set that camera up, we turned the GoPro on, it's this exact type of box at 9:50 a.m. Central Time, and then the sun goes down, however many hours later. That story in between, I've always wanted to be able to put it out there and show people. So starting in October, we're going to put it out from 2 different perspectives. There's the YouTube feed that we had, where you see us drive out to Mexico Beach and set the thing up. And as soon as you hear me turn the GoPro on, I cut from the YouTube feed to the GoPro and then just let it run. I've got better tools now to enhance the video, to make the contrast better, to see through some of that whiteout that the eyewall delivered. And we're going to put it on our Patreon site first for the people that are crowdfunding this. They obviously get the benefits, but then eventually, a couple of weeks later, I'm going to make it publicly available, that whole 5 or 6 hours, whatever it is, of the worst part, unedited. And I'm going to put the little timestamp at the bottom. So minute by minute, in real time, you'll see Brett Adair drive by. You'll see somebody else drive by. Some Fox TV station goes this way and then goes that way. All of that. You'll see toucans shuddering and shaking the roof come off. And then you'll see that eye wall come in. And if people have the time, that's almost like you can binge watch it. Just sit back and watch it hour by hour. That eye wall at point blank range from Mexico Beach, 100 yards, if that, from the Gulf of Mexico You know, I didn't invent this GoPro. I wish I had. It'd be a different story. But yes, this did it. It was my idea to do that. But this technology out of a Cracker Jack box, right, is what did it. And it shows us something that you wouldn't be able to see otherwise, or you'd be killed in a situation like that. That it's some of the greatest hurricane chasers of all time. You can't stand there next to that utility pole and film that stuff. That's what this is for. You know, we send stuff to Mars and to the outer edges of the solar system because it's not safe for people yet. Still isn't safe. Wasn't safe probably for Dan Rather to be out there in 1961, but he made it, and it inspired a whole generation of people. And now I can take a $500 camera and put it in the front of a Category 5 hurricane, and you know, hopefully it'll still be there when we go back. But thanks for you're right. I mean, Michael it's up there on the Mount Rushmore of incredible hurricane footage of all time, and we can still learn from it years from now.
Dr. Frank, if we only had this technology during Hurricane Camille.
That's right. Can I say a word about this? I'm so impressed with what Mark's doing. I hope we don't have to wait till a reporter dies before we then turn to his technology. There is absolutely no reason to have human life out there. They add nothing. As a matter of fact, most of the time, the shots that they give you are in protected areas. They don't tell you anything at all. And this camera system that he has, I absolutely do not know why all the networks are not knocking on his door to set this kind of a system up. It's a great system, and I think it's the way of the future, and I hope we don't have to have a loss of life before we realize that.
Well, I'll say one thing about that. A very visionary person, and you guys know this person, it was Dr. Steve Lyons, approached me in 2000 and challenged me to come up with something because he wanted that. He had the same worries that Dr. Frank has. And it took a while, but we had to develop it, and so forth and so on. I had to go through, you got to get there, you got to persevere. And then another visionary person, in my opinion, his name is Dave Clark, the former president of the Weather Channel.
Yeah.
Him and Brian Norcross and some other folks saw what I had done in the past, and they decided to take a chance. And in 2014, they finally did that and said, you know what, we're going to incorporate that, what you're doing, into our coverage. And now all the way here, 7 years later, 8th hurricane season in a row. I grew up with the Weather Channel. I would knock you over going to the TV for that 10 before the hour tropical update with John Hope. And now my stuff is on that same network. And, you know, people like Tom Lee and Nora Zemet there and Scott Thompson that help in the background, and all the producers, when I call or I email them and say, I got a camera in a certain place, they know that that's going to be in place of a reporter and give them something. So I will say that, you know, in short, the Weather Channel is doing that. But and for me, it's just an incredibly proud thing because I grew up with them. I grew up with Dr. Frank, and I grew up with the Weather Channel, and now he's complimenting me, and it's like, wow. I mean, talk about my head may not fit out of my office after this.
All right, so
I appreciate it.
We got to move on to picks of the week here. We're running a little long, but so everybody here on the show, you need a pick of the week, and mine is a piece from the Associated Press, and apparently Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York City has hired a private weather forecaster because he doesn't like the way the National Weather Service handled Ida. And he basically says that we're in a new world, making the implication this has never happened before. And he doesn't like the Weather Service products, and he's going to go hire somebody. Is that Troy? Is that you he's hired?
No, believe me.
No. Okay.
Somewhere Gary
I hate to tell the mayor this, but, you know, weather forecasting is a non-perfect science. And, you know, you're going to get errors like that. What's going to happen when this private forecaster goes bad someday? I guess you go find somebody else. Come on.
I think he hired Dr. Jacobs. I think it's Neil. Is it you? Anyway, that piece is my pick of the week, and we've talked about this before, and it is what it is. So, Dr. Jacobs, you got a pick for us this week? Go.
I do, but before I tell you my pick of the week, I did want to give a shout out to my wolf pack for their
I was going to bring that up, and
yes.
We were waiting in the parking lot of the Middle Eastern Food Festival, listening to it on the radio. When he missed that field goal, I just lost. I was like, "Oh my goodness!"
That was awesome.
But he came back.
So my pick of the week is a paper by William Faust Elliott. It's in BAMS. It's called An Informal Introduction to Numerical Weather Models with Low-Cost Hardware. And I'd urge you to read it because the low-cost hardware that they're running the models on is the Raspberry Pi. They now have the code. You can get it on GitHub. It's github.com/ncar/PiWarf.
One of these.
One of those.
Fingers crossed we get the UFS up and running on a Pi 4. You can buy these off the internet for like $50.
Yeah, we gotta.
And I'm anxiously awaiting when you can run the Wharf on a Commodore 64. That day's coming. But all of these picks will be on the website, weatherbrains.com. So, Jen, what's your pick of the week?
Before I do my pick, Dr. Frank, I apologize for not telling you about the pick of the week. I was so enamored talking to you this week, I forgot to tell you. So just as you're sitting here, if you can think of a link or a magazine, it could be anything that you would like to share that would help us. We send these links out. My pick of the week, the tornado segment tonight was on the devastating Ivy, Virginia tornado. We are rewriting that and enhancing it. Well, I started really delving into it today, and the path that is officially part of the record may be wrong. And I always want to try to get to find out what happened. What was the history? So I put the Chipmunks, Nick and Nelson, on it. And the next thing I know, Nelson is throwing me old weather charts from 1959, and we're looking at upper air data and try to find out, did it go east, like Grisula said, or did it come from the southeast to the northwest? The newspapers, and then also an article I found from a historian in that area, all said it started in Charlottesville and went more west. So that would be completely different. That completely changes the story. So my pick of the week is the NOAA Library of Old Weather Charts. Go there. You can find, I think Nelson said it's from 1871 to the present, all the daily old hand maps, and you can find out what happened. So we're going to try to deduce this. I've got them on it right now, and all I know is that they're in here charting things and looking at maps. We're trying to figure out which is right. I'm writing to the historian as well to find out what was his source. And so that will hopefully come out at the end of the week, but it may be longer if it's going to be a mess. But I just want to you can't always get the history 100% right because there's so many different things, but I certainly want to tell the story to the best of my ability. And of course, the main impact here was the tragic loss at Ivy, with 10 members of one family dying. And so I want to explore their story a little bit more for everybody. And that will be a free summary that will be out later this week.
Awesome. All right, Troy, what do you got for us?
Give me the foghorn, buddy.
Oh, I was not quite expecting that. But
there you go.
We've always got the foghorn. All right. So, Mark, what you got for us? And again, you plug away. Why don't you first off share for people that want to support your work, your Patreon link?
Oh, I appreciate that. And Patreon, in case you don't know what it is, it's an app and a website that's been created for people to support stuff that matters to them. Crowdfund it, but it's interactive. It's not like GoFundMe or PayPal or something else where there's a set amount and that's it. We all work together. And it's this interesting community for musicians and filmmakers, and several people in weather are on there. Pecos Hank, if you know him, or Weather Nerds. Levi Cowan's site is on there. A lot of people are using Patreon. So it's patreon.com/hurricane track, or you can go to it off the hurricanetrack.com homepage. And I appreciate that opportunity. It's grown a lot these last couple of years. And literally that Raspberry Pi I was holding up, people crowdfund this. We say, here's a list of stuff we need. People get involved. They buy these things for us. They help to code what we're doing. It's a big community. Patreon is amazing. It really is. Pick of the week, I'll say it's Hurricane Sam. And sort of in the future, when we get the TCR, the Tropical Cyclone Report for Sam, Weather Twitter was just bonkers yesterday. that everybody thought it was going to be a Category 5. And if you were watching, it was quite interesting because NOAA did some research missions in there. And it turns out that, the Hurricane Center was going with different readings than people thought. There was so much second guessing, and it was like watching people watching sports. If you didn't know what they were watching, you would think they were watching their team losing or something. So stay tuned. Many months from now, when the tropical cyclone report comes out for Sam, will it be upgraded later? Satellite presentation was like 7.0 at a couple points there. That technique that you know about, it was pushing it. So we'll see. I think Sam has a shot there at being 2021's so far Cat 5. Stay tuned.
All right, we'll see. So Dr. Frank, I'm going to turn it over to you. Give us something good. Give us a pick of the week.
Well, I didn't know there was going to be a pick of the week, but okay. But I have a couple points that I think are kind of interesting. Greta, is that the one, the little Swedish teenager, is in the news this last week as we move towards the next international conference of I think they call it the 26th. They'll get together. I wonder if anyone has told Greta that the temperature in her hometown has dropped 3 degrees in the last 8,000 years. And furthermore, when she gave her talk at the United Nations a couple of years ago, there was a letter in the hands of the Secretary General signed by 500 international scientists that said there is no climate emergency. Now, what I really would like to refer to you, if you're not aware of it, there's a group called the Carbon Dioxide Coalition. Dr. William Happer out of Princeton started this group 5 years ago. It's about 50 really credible academic people, and they have an excellent website, and they're doing an excellent job of trying to educate the people about climate change.
All right, so we'll make that your pick of the week. How about that? So Bill Murray, what's your pick of the week? Go.
Yeah, James, I would take the foghorn, but I'm going to hijack the pick of our own Scott Martin, who sent us a pick this week and says, even though I'm not a WeatherBrains panelist, I do have the pick of the week. He says that the emergency management group at South Lake there in Texas has put together a music video about Turn Around, Don't Drown. And I will send that to JP, so it will be on our website as the pick of the week. Now, next week, we're going to talk to writer Jeff Stern, who wrote a great article in the Atlantic about an Oregon town that rallied to repel an oncoming forest fire. And I think that's going to be a fascinating show. And then, Neil, you've got the show in 2 weeks with Mike Farrar. That's going to be fantastic. So looking forward to that. And then Tim Bryce is going to join us. Richard Brundridge is a man who's helped the Weather Service with public relations training over time. He's going to join us, and then Paul Suffern will join us on the 25th. And James, on the 1st, we're going to have a tribute to Al Mohler. Our friend Chuck Doswell will join us, along with Tim Marshall. And we've just got a bunch of incredible shows coming up. But I want to thank Dr. Frank, because tonight this has been one of my favorite shows out of over 800 that we've done. Thank you for your time, and we're just so glad that we had this chance to talk to you tonight, Dr. Frank.
Thank you.
All right. Well, goodness gracious, this was a great show. So here's the deal. So we're making a permanent change. Is that right, Bill, on the time?
That's what I hear. Labor and management have all come together.
Okay, so we're going to be doing the show Monday nights at 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Central. From here on out for those that watch live. But we know that most of you listen, and it really doesn't matter. If you want to send us an email, the email address, it is email@weatherbrains.com. Aubrey was out tonight, but she should be back next week. We'll do a quadruple email segment. And all of these picks of the week and all of the show notes on the website, weatherbrains.com. So on behalf of the entire WeatherBrains crew, I'm James Spann. Thanks for listening. Have a great week, and God bless. Dr. Frank, you're the greatest. Thank you, sir. It's an honor.